So let's switch over to DP. Let's talk about visual enhancements. Visual enhancements in DP11. So, DP10, we did a lot of work with fonts. We did a lot of work with scaling the UI. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in DP. I think in a lot of ways, I think we're ahead of the other DAWs when it comes to the ability to scale the UI for 4K monitors, things like that. So first thing we want to talk about is list font scaling. So let's actually go in and talk about the preference that's been added to do this. So under Digital Performer Prefs, let's go into text size. Text size. So list fonts. There are a number of list font windows, and we're going to actually talk about a few of them. Right now you can see I've got the chunks window up, which is one of the lists. You can see a list in here. What are the other ones that you can see here? Event list. Markers, track selectors. So in a way, what might be nice to do here, we'll come back to this preference here, we can actually leave it behind. Remember in DP, if you have a window up, you can always go up to Windows and you can see what's out there. Change continuous data. I didn't even realize it's out there right now. We can close that window, but you can see that preferences is in fact just hidden behind. We can always bring it forward. So let's talk about let's load up in the consolidated window. So in my world, I have a big monitor, a big Dell monitor connected to my Mac, and we've got, of course, the sidebars here. So let's just go to the sidebar and let's just click at the bottom, drag up, and let's put some things in here just so we can actually take a look at this new preference. So we can switch this over here to something like an event list, which you can see we've got some piano information in here. Might be nice to actually have in this one something like markers. So let's do that. Markers in here, and there is a marker at the beginning at bar 1. And so that's pretty nice. And let's just do, how about effect performance? Let's just put in a couple other things in here as well. Remember, effect performance would let me see specifically which effects are, taxing the processor. And a couple webinars ago, we did talk about, just as a quick side note, the ability to put Digital Performer now in live performance mode. So that puts everything in real time, no more pre-gen, which means you can switch on the fly. If you're working with a client, you're working with a director, and you don't want any interruptions to the audio, you might put it in live performance mode. Something like that. So we could see we've got effect performance there. That's set up. And maybe we could just put here something like the audio monitor window. So Shift A. Shift A is the audio monitor window. So now we can go back up to window into preferences and settings, and we're in text size. So let's just bump up. Now we can drag this, or we can just plus up, and you can see how it jumps up ahead here to magnify the actual list's font. So this is great. I love this. For my eyes, I love the way this looks. I'm one of those people who wears prescription glasses, but I don't have to for the computer based on the distance, for my particular vision. And we all have a certain way we have to set up our glasses and or our distance to our monitors. But you can see here how things look. And so for me, actually the default before DP11 was a 9. That was the typical size. And so now for me, I like to go up to at least 10. And that's a nice way for me to see it personally. And then just bumping it up. Bumping up these lists, very easy to do. It's a very simple thing, but I want you to see that, legend, MIDI monitor, effect performance, the audio monitor window are considered lists, markers, a lot of the stuff that we use all day. So I'll park this back here at 10. So let's look at a couple other options in this simple window, text size. Let's just look at project notes. Now remember, project notes is something we can just get from the top here. We can just get that from the project menu. So let's do that. Let's go down into project notes. So what I've done in project notes, and let's just pull this out here. Remember, if you double click at the black bar at the top, it pops out of the consolidated window. And you can see here some stuff I flew in from a score I worked on. And it's great. So, obviously in project notes, something you can type, something you can paste in, something you can bring in from basically anywhere where you can create text, email, you can fly this stuff in. So if we go back yet to the window, preferences and settings, we have a specific one now directly for project notes. So this is 14 right now, whereas if I was at 10, which is great for other lists, it's pretty small. So it's nice to bump this up a little bit, drag this bar, something like now we're at 16, and that looks very readable. So that's pretty handy for project notes. And again, that's just a simple concept. But if we go back up to project, we go down into lyrics. So I just went out online and I found a pretty famous song you've all heard a few times here. And so if I copy and paste it out of Google, it goes right in. I can go back into the preferences window, and we have a separate one here for lyrics. So easy to bump that up. So the nice thing about all of this capability that we've added here with 11 is that it's on top of scaling the UI. So that's interesting. So right now we can actually go back up to view, and scale. And remember, you've got Command plus. That's the default key binding. Command plus and minus is how you would basically zoom up or zoom down the overall UI. So let's just do that on top of scaling the lyrics, the project notes, and a little bit of the list font size. So let's do that. We're going to bring up the UI. And we can just kind of go off the deep end here where, you know, things are really, really magnified. And one important point here is that notice how there isn't any pixelation. It's very clean. Everything's very crisp. And so this was a lot of work, and it's very welcomed, and it's a huge plus for digital performer users. Again, very high resolution monitors, being able to find a combination of, you know, the overall scaling and then individual scaling for lyrics and project notes and anything within the lists themselves. So we'll go all the way back here to 100%, which is the regular resolution. So cool. That's just the very quick side note on this new capability here in DP11, and it continues again with the scaling of the UI in addition to it. So let's just close that up and move on. Save. Cool. So what's up next? Let's actually get into the chunks window. So why don't we just do a little house cleaning here? I'm going to actually get rid of some of these windows in the sidebar, and we'll set this one back over to something like the Track Selector. Cool. So chunks. Let's actually take the divider here in the consolidated window and make this a little bit bigger so you guys can really see what we're looking at here. In fact, why don't we also use our new option to actually bring that up a little bit in size, just so you can see it a little bit better. So let's just plus this up one. You can see it better. And so obviously chunks is a sort of a banner feature in DP, and we all know why. You know, being able to have multiple sequences, having multiple VRACs, having songs, all in one window where you're able to set them up for different cues for film scoring or for live playback. So if you think about DP, I mean, when we added clips, right? Clips lets me play back individual loops or audio phrases or MIDI phrases individually or within scenes. And now taking, you know, clips window, which is specific to each chunk, and being able to chain different chunks with different clips, and now being able to organize that with this new window. So what we're going to talk about in chunks is they've actually enhanced it with this ability to split the window, and also we're going to talk about folders and playlists within chunks. So let's get into that for a minute. So I've basically created in here, you know, obviously quite a number of different chunks. It's funny, we had Mike McKnight, who does the live tour, a lot of big major tours, and Mike has hundreds of chunks in his DP projects. You know, one of his projects was something like 300 gigabytes, the Roger Waters stuff with all the different versions. So it's funny, when we design something like this, we're really thinking about almost Mike specifically. Of course, there's a lot of people that have multiple chunks, but how can he work the best way? And so it's funny, when I see his projects, you know, he's creating sort of dummy projects for dividers and, you know, little things that he has to do to kind of keep himself organized. And we've done a lot of work to benefit that sort of working style. And it would actually be a benefit to, you know, composers who run, even if they run a dozen chunks within a given project, it's still a useful way to organize things. So let's get into that. So let's do this. Let me go up to this little icon now, which is called Split View. So Split View basically creates a mirror in the lower pane. So now you actually have two panes for the chunks, and they're basically mirrors of each other. But what's nice is that you're able to focus specific folders so that you can move things in and out of each pane. Now, one interesting thing about this is that each of these has its own cell focus. So notice at the bottom, this is the cell focus, which is this blue line that indicates that this is in focus and this is in focus. So I can switch back and forth. Now, the benefit of that, by the way, let me switch down below. So let's actually change the divider a little bit. You know, I think what I'm going to do is scale it back just a hair, just so that I can see things a little bit better. Let's do it like that. Hopefully you guys can still see it well. So you can see the top pane is highlighted, the bottom one is highlighted. So what that means, by the way, is if I go down below and I click on, let's say I highlight one particular chunk, when I switch to the top and I go to this cell focus, when I switch back, it's still highlighted, see? So if you're so what's the benefit of selecting something? Well, remember, there are shortcut commands for doing things for selected chunks. So if we go up to the commands window, setup commands, and let's say we start typing in duplicate, you'll notice there are commands like duplicate chunk. So if I'm dealing with cell focus, I could highlight a particular chunk and duplicate it in the upper pane, or down below, I could highlight it and I could duplicate it in the lower. So that's sort of the benefit of dealing with the cell focus. So that's something I want you to kind of be aware of, up above and down below. Now, we always had the ability to change the color of a chunk, right? You have the OS color palette. You can decide what the color is of the chunk. And of course, the order of the chunk, the name of the chunk, and things like that. But now let's actually talk about folders and playlists, because that's obviously a new thing. So we can actually, for the time being, and by the way, it goes without saying that we can search in each pane. So if I just type in 1, it's going to show me all the ones. I might say something like, well, let's look at 5, and there it's going to obviously, but remember, escape takes you out of the search field. Same thing down below. If I type in 6, there it is. I can escape, goes back to full. And actually now, if I actually hide the split view, it shows everything. So let's talk about folders. And what are the benefit of folders? So you can see we've got a VRAC, we can have multiple VRACs, we can have multiple sequences, and we can have multiple songs. So let's just highlight, a number of different sequences. Now we can actually, if we wanted to, we can actually just create at the bottom here, why don't we just create a new chunk folder by itself? So here's the chunk folder. And now what's interesting is I can just drag items, if I want to, down into the folder. So there it is, it's in there. And what's interesting is if I double click on the folder, it's showing the folder by itself, and you can see I can back up. Or what I could do is, and let me actually take something here out of the folder. And now if I highlight the folder, I can right click, I can delete it. And of course, it's really easy to obviously reorder the things. Or the other thing we might do is, let's just say we take these different variations of the first sequence, and now I can right click and I can actually do a new chunk folder from that selection. So now I've got another folder. So the benefit of split view, by the way, is down below. What if I double click on this folder? So now up above, I could say, well, I'd like to put 12 in that folder. So that's one of the benefits of having, even though in a way you're thinking, what's the benefit of it being mirrored, is that you could be in subfolders in the lower pane and you can drag things in and out from the upper pane. So that's one of the benefits of it. So we've just done that. When it comes to actually deleting a folder, I've asked the developers to do something like we're used to doing here, where you can actually remove and keep things, and maybe that's something they'll add. But for the time being, in order for you to remove a folder, take the contents of the folder out, okay, like this. Now the folder is freestanding. Now you can right click on it and you can delete the selection. So for the time being, you just have to move items out to be able to delete them. And maybe that's something we can have them add to here in the next couple versions of DP. So that's just creating a folder. By the way, folders can contain sequences, VRACs, and songs. So for instance, if I highlight these, I can right click and say, let's create a folder from that selection. There it is. And of course, you can color code, you can rename the folder, and we'll talk about the boundaries of folders in just a moment. So that's something that's nice to be able to do, right? You can obviously have nested folders. So here's the folder. We'll highlight these songs. We'll right click. We'll create a folder of just the songs themselves. And so again, if I double click, if I actually add split view, and down below, I might go into this folder and double click on it. So it's showing I might want to add something to that particular folder. So that's, again, the benefit of split view, and you can always go back. And when we talked about getting rid of the folder, all we have to do, of course, is simply move the items out and then delete the folder. Let's talk about playlists for a minute, because playlists are a little bit different. A playlist is something that you would use to play back in a live situation. So you can't put VRACs into a playlist. That's one of the key differences between a folder and a playlist. A playlist it looks a little bit different, and you can only have songs or sequences in playlists. So let's create a couple playlists. So the thinking with a playlist is, hey, we're going to do a show, or let's say you're not doing a live performance so much as you might be playing back a few back-to-back sequences for a director, let's say. The way that you've programmed it, you just want to do it this way. Or maybe it is, in fact, a live show. You've got 4 or 5 songs you're going to do for a television show or something like that. So we're going to take, let's say, 2 through 7, and I'm going to right-click on them. Now, remember, I can just simply click down below and create an empty playlist and then put things in it. So I could say, well, let's put 7 in there. I'm going to highlight it, drag it down to the playlists, and you can see that as I hover, it puts it in there. Notice that it's an alias. This is a really good design because it's an alias. All of my organization stays intact. And as I add to playlists, it creates aliases. So the benefit of the alias is that you can have as many playlists as you want. with different sequences. See? So for instance, let's say I rename playlist 1, that's tonight's show, and I'm already thinking about maybe tomorrow night's show, and I create a new playlist and I intermingle different ones. In fact, why don't we do this together? All just holding command, I'm going to take a different ones here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new playlist from that selection. So here's playlist number 2, here's playlist number 1, and I can have 7 in both because they're aliases. And so the idea of a playlist is, again, so you play them back to back. And that's why you can't have VRECs in them, because VRECs aren't really meant to be, they're not really a part of a performance. They're obviously where you load virtual instruments into them. So that's, and again, if I wanted to, let's say I go back to split view and I actually double click, and let's go back out of the folder into playlist 2. So now I'm thinking about tomorrow night's show, which is playlist 2, and I think, well, it'd be nice to actually have 4 in that show. I'll drag it down below. It creates the alias. I'm going to reorder these. Let me actually move the icon here so we can reorder these. And then, of course, I can change the color. So the other thing I want you to see, so it's very easy to create playlists. And again, playlists are meant to play them back to back. So now let's talk about chaining the chunks and sort of what's the benefit of these playlists and folders. So let's actually go out of this for a minute. We can get out of split view for a moment. So let's say tomorrow night we're going to actually queue up the show. So let me put this one in play. So there's the sequence. Now the sequence is basically one tick. That's how long this little sequence is. It's completely empty. But look up above here. What I'm going to do right now is set it so that it actually cues the chunk. So as one plays for its tiny, tiny little segment, when it finishes playing its duration, it's going to park and queue up the second one. So I'll just hit play. Boom, done, ready to go. So now let's go into the other mode, which is chaining chunks. So now watch how, since this playlist is comprised of these 6 different aliases of chunks, it's just going to cycle through those. And that playlist is a boundary. Watch. So now it's going to play. And I'm playing basically sequence after sequence after sequence, and it's just cycling through that boundary, that playlist. So it's fun to see how DP is playing those sequences back to back. Now, obviously, a sequence might be, 500 bars. And now one thing I wanted to quickly point out as a reminder for people who have used chunks, if there's virtual instruments within a chunk, there's going to be a load time potentially, right? It's true if you had ivory in one chunk and then a separate ivory in a second chunk, it's going to take a breath to load those samples when it switches. And that's the benefit of the VRAC, remember? So if you're somebody who needs to be able to switch very quickly in a live performance or in a situation where you're previewing, cues for a director or something like that, put everything in the VRAC, which a lot of people already do. We have someone like Rick Marvin on as a guest who has a massive VRAC or multiple VRACs where everything is in there. Usually it's, obviously Vienna Ensemble Pro hosting tons of contacts and omnispheres and things like that, all in the VRAC. So there's very little to nothing in DP. And that way switching on the fly is very, very doable, and there shouldn't be any hiccups at all. With digital audio, it's also the same. It's interesting how if you had slow hard drives, let's say old, SATA spinning drives might have to hiccup a little bit. With SSDs, you can switch very quickly between chunks, and even if you have audio playing back, plugins are no problem with plugins. Those will easily switch without any kind of hiccups. So that's cool. The other thing I want you to see, by the way, is that folders are also boundaries. So remember how we were playing back to back and we were chaining? Well, we can do the same thing, and we can actually use folders for that. So if I actually play enable, let's just create maybe another folder up here for a second. We'll take these, we'll right click, we'll create a new chunk folder from the selection. And let's play enable this one. Now it's not a playlist, but when I actually hit play, it's going to do the same exact thing. So this was something, as I was previewing and building my demo, I came across and I thought, well, that's actually really great. I can actually use a folder as a boundary for playing back different chunks. And that's actually cool. So you wouldn't have to necessarily just use playlists. And by the way, songs, just as a quick reminder, the reason why you could also play songs in playlists is because, remember, songs are made up of chunks. So if I double click on song 1, now we're looking at the song tab up above here, and I could say, well, song 1 is going to be actually 3 playing into 7, playing into 9. So when I play enable this song, it's going to play those sequences back to back. Now, if everything is in the VRAC, it will make these transitions perfectly. That's actually a very powerful feature in DP. It's not every day people use songs, but it is a powerful thing. It was interesting. It was born out of an era when people were using songs as actual, sections of songs. You had a sequence that was your verse. You had a sequence that was your chorus. People don't really think like that anymore. We always think in a linear fashion, but it does still come in handy. And actually, at one point, I have a video that I was working on that I was editing for Motu about when I went over songs. And one of the coolest things about songs, I still get a kick out of the idea of taking this version 3 and putting it at the same time. So now you're superimposing two different chunks at the same time. And in my example, they were at the same tempo, but one was in 5/8 and one was, I think, like in 7/8. And so there was really interesting, cool meter things, over the bar kind of things happening between the two different things. So how many DAWs on the market can play multiple sequences at the same time? That's such a cool feature. But I'm kind of, going off the deep end here with this, but I did want you to see some of the new things here. So let's just kind of take a quick recap, and I want to make sure if there's any questions, let's get into it. So we've got the split view, remember, which is a mirror, but you can obviously always look into a particular folder so that you can drag things in and out of those particular, whether they're playlists or folders. And of course, color coding, naming, and then having the boundaries of playlists where it'll stay when you're queuing chunks within that. Folders also have boundaries, which is great. And just remember, one key important point about playlists is that playlists are not where VRACs go. Playlists are for sequences and or songs, which are of course made up of sequences. So that's kind of a cool new thing that they're doing: searching, chaining, using those as boundaries, naming them, and then using this to your advantage. And then remember that you have a focus as well. So if there's any questions about that, now is a good time.
Well, there's a couple that I pulled up. Somebody asked, was Don Davis a DP guy, since his name was in your project notes?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Don's 100% DP guy.
Can chunks in a playlist overlap?
Can chunks in a playlist overlap? No, but remember that playlists can have songs, and songs can have multiple sequences.
Right. Someone asked for you to play some examples, but I'm not sure you can do that since you don't have any real stuff in. Those are one tick long sequences. So
yeah, it was just to show you the new features. I mean, you could easily build your own as an example and play with whether or not you could actually use that. It's going to be depending on, like, again, the nature of the instruments, if they're in a VRAC, how much audio, how many plugins. It's always good for each of us to test that and specifically and see if that's something you can do either in a live situation or a playback for, like you said, a director or something.
if you play two chunks at the same time in a song and the chunks share a VRAC, what happens?
Oh, that's fine. That's what it's for. It's okay. Yeah, you can have VRACs can contain things that, whether if it doesn't matter if you're playing back 3 or 4 stacked sequences on top of each other in a song and they're all pointing to the same instruments. It's just that make sure that you have the polyphony and make sure that it can handle, you know, the notes and the memory footprint for that. But yeah, it could do it. It'd be interesting to try. In my example, I had 2 playing. Like, again, I was doing this over the bar odd time signature thing, which was pretty fun. But I wasn't overly. What you might do, just maybe even just conceptually, is have multiple VRACs just to keep things sort of organized. If you wanted to, you wouldn't necessarily have to. You could have everything in one giant VRAC. Although I know a lot of film composers will have multiple VRACs. They'll say, hey, this is my contact VRAC, this is my Spectrasonics VRAC, or my play engine, blah, 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 blah. They'll break things up.
Right. Reed Robbins asked, when you chained the things together, it kept repeating and going from the final chunk back to the first chunk and passing back through. Is it always that way, or is it possible to make it stop after the last chunk?
Yeah, what you want to do, since mine are obviously microscopically small, is while the last one's playing, just take it out and just have it cue, or simply just turn off the icon. It's designed so it won't have an interruption. So it's playing. Oh, here comes the last one. It starts playing. Disable the chain feature. It will no longer loop, and it won't interrupt the audio, because that's obviously an important point. And Mike McKnight can speak to that. Like, if you disable that, toggle that button, it's not going to interrupt the audio.
Is it possible to render a playlist to audio?
I mean, you know what's interesting? Not really. I mean, unless you were to somehow just record the audio out into like a third-party application on your computer, something that would pick it up. Like, the other applications that would do that. Or what you could do is just go, oh, here was my order. I'm going to build a song out of that. And then I'm going to actually play the song and render. Does that make sense? So you would have, unfortunately, you couldn't just do it on the fly, but certainly
Right.
you could build a song out of those same playlist chunks and then render that. But it's a good question. It'd be interesting if you could just hit a button somehow and tape, quote, record the output of that playlist, but that's not how it's designed.
And it's probably not going to work for you for the now, but there was a request at some point to go back to basics with chunks, to do another session where you kind of
Yeah.
cover more
It's always,
basics with.
like you said, we're kind of in 11 mode right now just to keep everybody moving forward with all the new features, but we definitely will come back because and just as a flagship concept, remember that you can have multiple sequences. Think of a sequence as, let's say, 50 bars of some piece of music. Could be a song, could be a cue and a score. When you can have multiple songs, multiple, ideas within one project, and then you can chain them and they can even share attributes. And so that's a very cool thing that DP does because you can be play enabling one and viewing the contents of an inactive chunk. And that's such a beautiful thing, like especially on a film score where you might want to take a section. Hey, there's a really cool drum percussion part we did at the end of Q1. Can we put that in Q3? Sure. Instantly. I don't even have to play enable one. I just have to look into the contents of it, copy and paste it into the active chunk. It's a very cool feature. All right, so let's get out of split view and let's actually go back. And as a reminder, remember, move things out of the folders before you delete them. And that's always a good thing. And then remember, having aliases in playlists means you can have as many as you want, which is really handy. All right, so let's go over to a different chunk. Chunks for me, when doing presentations, is the greatest thing ever because if I had to have them as separate songs, I'd have to load and close DP for every project, for every demonstration, everything that I show you would have to be its own project, which is a load time. And so it's always so nice to, especially as a presenter, having it all built into one project. So let's talk about, again, we're talking about visual enhancements in this version. Of course, the chunks is a part of the visual enhancements, right? It's functional, but it also has a visual component. Let's talk about something, let's close the chunks window. And let's make some screen real estate here. So we've got a very simple project with one instance of contact and a couple of different assignments here. In fact, let's just make sure here in contact, I'm using the Kirk Hunter library, which was an inexpensive one, but just because maybe many of you have it and it's easy to use and has good sounds. So I've loaded a couple of different alto flute key switches here, and you can see channel 1, channel 2, and I've got a harp here in channel 3, just to make a very easy sketch. So visual enhancements, let's talk about the MIDI editor for a minute and the fact that now we've always had the track selector. Now remember in DP10, we added some great things to the track selector, like the ability to search. Now, a lot of people may have very many tracks that they need to look through, and being able to search by a track name in the track selector is a useful thing. Remember in DP10, we also added the ability to look for specific kinds of tracks, right? Hey, show me only the MIDI tracks. I only want to see, show me these tracks, show me everything, show me only, and hide certain times. I don't want to see MIDI tracks or whatever. So you have the ability to show and hide different types of tracks. And also, don't forget you have layouts. So you put your track selector in a state that's very unique to a cue you're working on. Something is very dense, and you have to look at certain things to get through some kind of orchestration. And it would be really useful to say, I need to get back to this. I'm just going to save this as a layout, something very specific about the combination of factors. So they've gone even further now with DP11, some really, really good stuff. So let's talk about it. We've got what's called the channel selector. So let's actually make sure that we're showing all the data types. So in addition to Track Selector, where of course Track Selector is simply just telling you which tracks are visible in the window. So the Track Selector also has a Channel Selector, because remember, it's something important. DP11 now has multi-channel MIDI tracks, right? Multi-channel MIDI tracks. As an extension, it was a benefit for MPE. It's a benefit for articulation maps. So what that means is, let's say you have a controller and it's set up to transmit on channel 10. Well, remember with MIDI tracks, it's set to any. As you hit record, it's going to accept the incoming MIDI data, but it's also going to assign it to the channel that it's coming in on. So if it's transmitting on channel 10, it's going to come in on channel 10. And output is interesting too. You can specify the MIDI output But you can also specify, you can go to any MIDI channel. So that's something that's actually an important point. Okay, cool. So let's go back into the window for a minute here in the track selector. So multi-channel MIDI tracks is a huge benefit. We'll actually get into it here in this example. So you want to make sure, by the way, in this case, if I actually take the pencil tool and I draw in an actual flute note. Now look up above here. We've got information about it. It's, you know, here's the note, here's the velocity. This is the MIDI channel right now. MIDI channel is set to 1. So what's interesting is if you didn't know that, let's say you've deselected channel 1 in the actual channel selector, and you're looking here for the alto flute, and you say, I don't understand. It's not in here. It's because make sure that the MIDI channel is also selected. So that's kind of a key point. Make sure the MIDI channel is also selected. And that's one of the new columns in the actual track selector. So MIDI channel, also Event Type Selector. So what do we mean by events? Now these are all the common controllers, right? Notes, clips, sound bites, you know, obviously pitch bend and things like down below, all of the standard, you know, stuff that's mapped, modulation, volume, breath, and so on and so forth. And look in here, you even see things like meter change, mode changes, tempo changes. All these different event types are now available so that you can select to see them or not see them. Because remember, Track Selector is all about showing and hiding different kinds of things. Do you want to see the track? Do you want to see which MIDI channels do you want to see? Also, what kind of events do you want to see? And we'll actually, again, create a cue, a very simple cue to kind of illustrate this. So we've got all these are set to go. Now look at the bottom here. We have another column there. These are the unassigned remaining controllers. So notice, for instance, it starts at 0 and it goes to 3. That's because 1 is modulation and 2 obviously is breath controller. And all these others are in here as well. So if you're using other controllers, and I'll actually do an assignment to a controller as well, so we'll actually get to use that. So again, common event types, all the remaining controllers can be seen or not seen, hidden or not hidden. Remember, sometimes it's not about what you're seeing. It's about what you don't want to see so that you can actually copy and paste something. That's kind of important. It's like the view filters in general in DP. We use the view filters so that we can see things, but we also want to use the view filter to not see things specifically when we want to copy and paste data. So that's one of the benefits of the view filter. So in a lot of ways, a lot of the guts of the view filters are now actually built in specifically to the track selector. And it really makes it useful. And we'll actually apply it here. So let's actually close the controller area. And let's just just for a minute, before we build a little cue, let's just talk about colors for a minute. So you can see right now my flute track is actually assigned to this green color. Let's go back to MIDI for a minute. So up above, you know, if I right click, obviously I can just change, I get the full color palette in DP. And of course the color palette is actually based on whatever you have it set here kind of globally. You know, rainbow is obviously just going to give me a full spectrum of colors. And that's kind of a good one from my eyes. So I can obviously pick the color. Now look what happens when you go into the channel selector. So now again, I'm looking at MIDI channel 1 through 16. Every MIDI track has 16 MIDI channels now. Not just a virtual instrument, the MIDI track itself has 16 different MIDI channels that you can use since it's now multi-channel. But look, when it comes to colors, I can say, well, I can actually use the track color, and that's the default. But I could also make channel 1 be a specific color. So, you know, and again, do I want the colors to be based on the track? Do I want the colors to be based on their MIDI channel assignment? It might be nice to just keep it consistent and just use the track color. But I did want you to see that you have the ability when it comes to the MIDI channel to actually specify whatever color you want. So, and we'll actually use that here in a minute to show you how I can differentiate between a different part. So we'll close this. Let's look at the event type selectors. So look at, let's say in the case of notes, I obviously want to see the notes. I can hide the notes. If I right click, I can use the default event color. And what is the default? Well, it looks like the default in this case is just, I mean, I guess it's based on this flute color, but this particular color. But I can use the track color. I can use the channel color. So remember, when I had the channel color set to a pink color, I could actually use that for these particular events. Now look at also you can do. You have articulation. So when you're using articulation maps and you pick, let's say one particular articulation gets a certain color, well, you can use that as well. So you have different choices. What do I want that MIDI channel or that event type to look like? Or you can have a very specific event color. So again, choosing from the color palette. Just some options. How do I want to see, when I see notes, am I going to give something, maybe notes would obviously follow the overall track, but maybe for certain types, especially things like modulation. I want my modulation to be the default color. Well, what if I want my modulation to be something like, I don't like the yellowish color for mod, so I'd like to make it sort of a purple color. And you can see you can change that there. So again, just giving you some options here for colors, for event type. Same thing here with controllers. So as you can see in controllers, I could just say, well, in this case, I want to use the default, which is this kind of grayish color, or I want to actually use the track color or the MIDI channel color or a specific color. So let's see, we're on gray, and maybe we switch it to an orange color. So you can see you just got some, just right click in those areas and decide whether you want a custom color, a MIDI channel color, or the actual track color. And that would, and obviously in the case of, let's go back to the default. In the case of event type, you also have the choice of articulation maps color. Cool. So that's the quick rundown on what you're seeing in here and how you can actually utilize this, whether you're searching. And by the way, again, the work that we're doing in this window, I'm going to stay in the MIDI window, is also true in the sequence editor. So everything we're talking about right now is identical in the sequence editor. So when it comes to, hey, I want to see sound bites, I want to see certain controller data, I want to see different MIDI channels for these different MIDI tracks, you can obviously go in here and all this applies. It's just that we're going to focus today in the MIDI editor. Cool, so I hope that sort of makes sense. Let's just, again, create a really, really basic cue, and that way you can sort of see it in action. Let me just go back here and let's just make sure that we're seeing all of the data. Save. So what do I have here in this alto flute? Now, one cool thing they did, the developers of this patch, if I play the patch, now I go to the mod, which I'm playing the complete control, which has that strip there for modulation. It gives me vibrato as I push up. So let's just play a super simple little line here that we can just record. And let me just move this out of the way. And so we're at 90 beats per minute. Let's just turn on our metronome and play a little line. Okay, simple little part. And so let's just go into the MIDI window, and let's just, right off the bat, by the way, I'm just going to go and show only the data types in the sequence. And sure enough, as I back up to bar 1, it's showing me my alto flute. Let's see, it's showing me that it's MIDI channel 1, which it is, up above, MIDI channel 1. It's showing me down below that I'm looking at my mod. Now, all the things you're used to doing down below, and we can actually show, let's just hide the chunks window for a minute. All the things you're used to doing in terms of setting up any kind of filters down below for looking at certain types of data, you can still use those, although it's so handy to be able to hide it and just use this. It's almost like what we've done is taken the view filter and taken the bottom pane here and just built it into the left side, so that it's so easy to combine and look at multiple data types. Now, I don't have any controllers in because remember, modulation is one of the event types. That's one of the ones that's already common, right? That's a common one. So this is great. Now, do I want to edit any of this vibrato? It's fine. It's actually working really well. But let's actually now record in controller data. So let's actually do that. Go back into tracks. We'll go into contact. And so here's what I thought we would do as an easy example. So you guys see we've got reverb set up right here. And it's set, it's a nice sound. It's not particularly wet. But if I just right click in here and MIDI learn, if I go up to the complete controller and I just turn one of the knobs, it automatically assigns. That's great. Now, what's cool about contact, if I right click in here, it shows me that that's controller 21. Not that I really need to know, although it's nice to see that it's going on the right channel and that I'll see that data on controller 21. And it's nice to see that, it gives me that readout. So we can close this window. So I thought, well, why don't we just overdub me riding the reverb, and just for fun. So have it dry on some of those faster runs and then sort of swell up the reverb a little bit. Why not? It'd be a good way to demonstrate this. We'll go back to MIDI and we're parked at bar 1. We want to make sure that overdub is turned on. So overdub will not replace the notes. If I don't touch the notes, it won't play the notes, but it's only going to pick up this, this message coming in, which is the reverb level. So let's do it. I'm just going to hit record. Okay, cool. So we're going to rewind to the beginning, and now sure enough, there's the alto flute. It's on channel 1. It's showing me notes, it's showing me modulation, and it's showing me controller 21. Perfect. So this is a really nice new addition to DP11, because now I could just say, well, I don't want to see mod right now. I do want to see my performance. Let me clean this up here, blah, 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 blah. I'd like to do some more editing with my reverb, and so on and so forth. And also I'm thinking, well, I don't know if I like this gray color so much. Let me actually right click and choose a color for this. And maybe this purple will be nice. It'll stand out. So now let's look at mod. And now look, I've got it set up where I'm not filtering. I'm not doing the quick filter. I'm superimposing so I can see both my mod and of course my reverb right there. So that's actually pretty useful right inside there and being able to pick. Now, remember, one really, really important feature is that I'm used to just seeing all of these different tracks, right, are all visible right now. But remember, you can go to show only data types. And that is a huge time saver because it only shows what you're actually using. Huge time saver. Cool, so this is great. I love this. So now let's talk about that MIDI channel assignment and having multiple channels within one track. So even though this legato flute plays this really well, in fact, why don't we just tidy up these notes a little bit? I'm holding my grid's on, so I'm holding command to toggle off the grid. Let me do a little bit of cleanup work on my notes. Save. Okay, so here's what I wanted to do. I'm going to highlight these, even though it's not particularly fast. Why don't I do it like this? I'm going to hold Shift, and I'm going to just select all of my short notes in this. And so they're non-contiguous, but I'm going to do that. Okay. Now I'm going to go up to region and I'm going to change the MIDI channel to channel 2. So now look, channel 2 is actually showing up now as one of the channels that's being used for this particular alto flute track. I have to make sure that contact now is set up to be on any channel. This is really important, that when I'm playing it back, it's not going to channel 1 specifically, it's going to any and all channels in contact. Now remember, in contact, I have the alto flute, the second instance of alto flute set to marcato. And that's the key. It's like doing a key switch in a way, right? I'm playing back one MIDI track and some notes are going to MIDI channel 1 and some notes are going to MIDI channel 2. And it's like doing a key switch or articulation map. But when I go into the MIDI window, you know, and so I'm not sure what it's going to sound like, but let's just hear it. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Those notes are a little bit more marcato, and it kind of, you know, obviously it's a question of taste, and maybe we would keep it legato, but the idea is not lost on the fact that you're able to view just that specific channel, or you can view both channels and different controller data. So for instance, also, let's just say in the case of a harp, if I play a harp chord underneath it, and I add sustain, so let's just do that. So we have some sustain messages. We don't really need to overdub necessarily. We can take that off. So I'm in the harp. Let's see what it sounds like. So let's just play in something so that we have some controller 64 messages. So I want you guys to see that as well. So I've got the metronome turned on. I come in at bar 2. I'm going to hit record. Okay, save. So let's now go back, take this out of record, and go back into the MIDI window. And so we'll rewind to the beginning. And now let's actually look at the harp part. And sure enough, I have it set up right now as a preference to not show switches for sustain. I'm actually showing it in the traditional way. And so I can edit those sustain messages. So again, I could go back to flute, and I can just take it out, and I can basically hide sustain. So that's just the idea, is being able to view the tracks, view the channels, view the event types, the controllers, and that they'll automatically filter the ones that are actually in use. It actually makes your life, I feel like using this combination for isolating a certain type is even faster than changing the focus down below. Of course, you can set up shortcuts, right? That's one of the benefits of being able to set up shortcuts to switch between controllers. And I'm sure many of you have already done that, so you can continue using that. But also just know that you have the ability to do it as well in the left column. So that's just a quick way of being able to filter out based on the channel assignment, the event type, and the controller. Questions?
JR was having a problem. He says, I don't see a drop-down menu in my track selector, and I don't see a way to change its width. I see the track selector itself, just no drop-down menu and no width adjuster.
Okay.
The track selector button is there in all the windows, and it opens and closes the track selector.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about something here. It's actually on my list, and we're going to actually, it's a good segue into something that I wanted to touch on anyway. And that is, okay, we're looking at the track selector right now. Let's actually go up to preferences for a minute, and let's go to edit windows. So let's do that. Here's edit windows. So now at the top, towards the top says track selector button. So now let's just look at these for a minute. Always opens the track selector window. Okay, means that the track selector will always appear as its own window. Does that make sense? The track selector has two ways of existing. It can be its own floating sort of window in the consolidated window or on its own. It can be its own window, or it can be part of the actual window, an edit window. If I set this to the second option, let's say as an example, and I close my track selector from the actual consolidated window for a minute. Now watch this. I've got the second option selected here in edit windows, which is I'm going to only use the edit windows track selector. So if I go to the bottom of the MIDI editor and I click on this little rectangle in the very bottom left corner, and I click on it. Now this embedded, it is not currently resizable, okay? And you'll notice that I don't have as many options in this window. So a couple things. You can't resize it, and you can't actually go into the menu to actually show and hide certain types of data. So I'm a big advocate, at least until we readdress this issue, don't use the second option. Don't use the second option, which basically means don't use the situation where it's using the edit windows track selector, because you can't change the width. And very quickly, if you have a long name, you can't see it. It truncates it in a certain way. So what's the workaround for that? If you go back to preferences, I love the third option, which is that opens up a track selector window, which means it's a separate window, and it's going to be for whatever editor you have in focus, that's inside the consolidated window. So if you're working in the consolidated window, it opens a track selector as its own sidebar window. If you're outside of the consolidated window, it creates it, but it's outside. So this is the sort of the best of all worlds. Now watch when I have it set to this, which is my preference, and I hit done, and I go to the track selector, it opens up the sidebar with a track selector that's ready to work on this window. Now look, I have complete resizability. I have the ability to set up layouts and show certain types of data. So that's the workaround. Edit Windows preference and set it to the third option.
You can see they're separated because the blue outline around your editor window, yeah, that shows they're two separate parts. And you got a giant all capitals O from JR. So you solved that problem. Well done.
Cool.
When you were looking at the flute part, somebody asked about using the event type selection to not display the velocities. Is that possible?
Yeah, the velocities, well, that's where you'll have to use the quick filter at the bottom. There isn't velocities currently in the event type for whatever reason. That's an interesting question. Why isn't that one of the actual options? I mean, you can use as a workaround the quick filter, but it's not something you'll find in the event type. Let's go over now and talk about a couple of real simple things, which is the resizability of the MIDI faders. So this is something that we can just do. Let's just switch this over now over to a channel strip. So let's do that, channel strip. And you can see now we have long throw faders as a default. This is pretty useful. I mean, if I resize the window, you can see that it scales automatically. And so we can set this, we can change this. If we go into the mixing board, you can see, of course, we have the channel strip, we have the mixer faders. Let's go to the top left, to the top right corner here, and you'll see in the mini menu of the mixer, we have something called fader height. And right now it's set to dynamic. So just like I showed you, as I resize the mixer, whether again, it's in the consolidated window or it's freestanding, what's useful, I mean, you can make, if you have a really big third, fourth monitor, something like that, and you have a big mixer on there, and you can resize, use the full screen for that whole particular window, and it's going to have super long throw faders in there that'll scale to the size of your monitor. So that's really useful. And then also we have pre-configured things like short. You can see that's the original. That's like DP10 on back size. And then, of course, we can go over to something like medium. And medium is, obviously in the middle there, and then all the way up to tall. Now, what's interesting about tall is that they're not scaled. Remember, they're just going to fill the monitor all the way up. So it really is kind of useful to use the dynamic ones that will fit automatically to the size. One thing I've noticed also is if I go back, well, let's say to something like dynamic. See, I'm a big fan personally of putting something like the meter bridge down below. So when I'm mixing something, it's really nice for me to see the overall output. You wanted to make sure your mixes are at a certain reference level. Visually, I want to know where I am. So I like to do it this way. Now, check this out. This is something interesting. Right now, my channel strip, and this is all set to dynamic, which is using all the space it has. But watch this when in the mixing board. I can make these, because I don't want to lose the top for doing insert presets and inserts. Look how small that fader is. So when you're actually in dynamic, you can get smaller faders than small. Watch this. If I go back over to small or short, you see how I lose my assignments at the bottom. So even if you're somebody who likes to have something like the meter bridge at the bottom or some other window at the bottom, dynamic is actually shorter than short. You can actually make those faders even smaller. So I know it all depends. Everybody's completely different, right? Maybe you want super long faders, you want resizable, a fixed short, fixed medium, and so on. But if you're somebody who also wants to be able to make things small, dynamic is smaller than short. So that's kind of an interesting idea. So this is something that is useful to have a long throw fader. And let's just maybe set it back here to dynamic. And that way we get these nice long faders. Cool. Save. All right, so that's a very simple little thing. Let's talk a little bit about, I did want to mention something which is kind of important for Windows users. And there was actually a lot of work that we did in terms of text rendering. So the look right now of Digital Performer on Windows 10 and Windows 11 is going to look a lot crisper. So there's things they've done with text alignment. They've done tweaks to the actual graphics in Windows. It'd be interesting to see maybe for those of you who are out there on the Windows side of things, if you've seen a difference in the visual look of DP11 on Windows. I'd be curious to see. I haven't had a chance to really run it. I have a PC that I test on, and I haven't had a chance to really put it through its paces to see, but be curious to see if you guys have seen that on the Windows side.
Oh, it came up earlier in the text when you were talking about text resizing. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was just an illusion of being able to have, larger text on the screen. And I thought DP looks great in DP11. But if you guys did a lot of work, it does show because it is really, really crisp.
So you got a request, slightly different direction, to go over VEP MIDI and how to set their MIDI channels 0 to 15 for DP11, new 16 channels per MIDI instrument.
The easiest way really is to go to Add Track, Instruments with Options. Instruments with Options saves you a lot of time. It's something that, it's funny, I find myself using this window more than Create, than being able to actually go up and use Create Tracks. For whatever reason, for my brain, because I'm not wanting to do more than, I don't need to do audio tracks and master tracks and all these different things. I just want a virtual instrument. So every time I want to add a virtual instrument, I always go to Instruments with Options, always. And I always say, oh, cool, give me one, Native Instruments context stereo, and give me 16, MIDI tracks. Now, remember the way that the cores are set up on a computer, that one core is assigned to the entire virtual instrument. So if you're doing very, very big, heavy virtual instruments, you might want to split those up into a couple instances of contact with 8. And that's for another day. But if they're obviously light little samples, Kirk Hunter type stuff, then it's fine to have 16. So I've added 1. Now I could add 4 contacts with 8 MIDI channels. And you can see that they're going to create a folder. And when it does the MIDI channel assignment, it obviously it adds the multiple. And then of course, what's really nice is that it does all the consecutive assignments. So you can see as I move this out of the way, is that there's contact MIDI channel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Same thing with VEP, no problem being able to do it that way. And then don't forget, just as a reminder, let me actually just clean up a little bit here in this. I don't want to necessarily undo it. Let me just keep this here. Zoom gets in the way. All right, so let's just say in here, I'm going to highlight these channels. And remember, under Option A, you have audio, we have assignments for audio tracks, but we also have assignments for MIDI tracks as well. So assignments for MIDI inputs or MIDI outputs. So if I said, well, why don't we actually assign these to my other Kontakt instance? So I'll assign all these to, my first instance of Kontakt. Now, if I pick Kontakt 1, it will assign all the other tracks consecutively. So you can obviously also do track assignments. If you've just generically added 16 MIDI channels, you can use Option A. Option A will let you do the MIDI assignments. Although remember, it's super easy to just get in the habit of using instruments with options.
And Benoit also said, while ordering a new MacBook Pro, do we need a lot of GPUs for DP and plugins, or is the M1 Pro quite enough? Hard to tell if GPUs are useful.
It's interesting. I mean, I think for if you're not somebody who's driving high res videos, like if you're film composing and you're projecting out, 4K video for your clients, in addition to all the graphic stuff that you're doing within virtual instruments, then you need that extra juice. Then I would say, yeah, you know what, spring for it. But if you're not really projecting the HD videos and scoring situations, I would say the M1's plenty fast for doing everyday graphic stuff. I wouldn't. Yeah, that to me that would be the dividing line if you really are pushing HD video all the time.